Brandi, I am thrilled to be here with you today. Enabling progress towards a more equitable world is a passion that we at Citi share with you. And we all know the dismal stats. A mere 22% of artists, 12% of songwriters, and only 2% of producers are women, despite representing half of all digital music consumers. So while there's a clear problem, we see immense opportunity, which is why in partnership with the ANA, Citi helped launch the See Her, Hear Her initiative to improve the representation of women and girls in music. It's so important for young girls to see themselves represented. And we always say, if you can see it, you can be it. And so at Citi, we are excited to be honoring you with the Clio Music Impact Award for the impact that you are making on the movement to increase gender equality and inclusion in the music industry and beyond. And this award is just the latest in a string of major accomplishments, including a New York Times bestselling memoir, Broken Horses. Congratulations, and I'm so happy that you're here with us today.
I'm so happy to be with you. Thank you so much for all the kind words and the acknowledgement and for all the work that you guys are doing to address this important issue.
Thank you. So let's just jump right into it because we have a lot to talk about and I know everybody is so eager and anxious to hear from you. And here's my first question. At Citi, we know the important role representation plays in narrowing the pay gap, and we've been committed to transparency and accountability in driving progress in this area in finance. Given the extreme gender imbalance in the music business that we just talked about in the stats, how do you address it as an individual in the industry, and how can brands and a movement like See Her, Hear Her help drive change?
Well, as I've gotten older, I have taken to addressing it fundamentally in terms of how I conduct my tours, compilations that I'll appear on, festival stages, just creating a personal connection with bookers and promoters and people that are planning and sort of curating these things to make sure that an appropriate number of women are being included, that an appropriate number of people of color are being included, and that an appropriate number of LGBTQ plus people are being included. And not just in pedestrian ways, but in meaningful ways, making sure that if I'm going to be on a headlining stage at a festival, that at least one other day another woman is going to be headlining, or that they're not going to be relegated to beer gardens and side stages, but they're going to be put in prominent penultimate positions on stage. So these kinds of things are not things that I paid attention to 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, when I probably still should have been. But it's one of those lessons that I've just learned as I've gotten older and tried to implement more and more in the way I conduct myself as an artist.
It's such a great lesson for all of us, right? Using the platform that we have, and it's never too late to actually make an impact. So that's wonderful. I am certainly a fan of your all-female supergroup, the High Women. Can you talk about what drove you to create the group and how it could impact country music?
Well, one of the things that drove me to helping to create the group was that I was raised in rural Washington State, out in the Cascade foothills, which is where I still live now, creature of habit. And I grew up listening to country music. We called it country and Western music because, we're from the West, so we wanted to believe that we could do country too. And actually, it was like we were so fond of it that, I came from a family environment where it was kind of assumed that that was the appropriate music to listen to. That music is wholesome. That music is the story of people's like us and our lives. And I do feel that even though I'm queer, that I had ample representation in that genre, at least in the form of other women telling stories about things that are, not about being in a pickup truck or having a koozie of beer for the day, but, about falling in love and having careers and wanting to travel the world and see wide open spaces, as the chicks put it back in that time. Right. I had Reba and I had Tanya and I had Dolly. And then now I'm a mother, I'm raising girls, and cut to 2016. From the 80s when I started listening to country music, and we have one woman with a number one hit on radio in 2 years. Mm-hmm. And that's a stark difference. That's a really good example of progress going backward, which it can do when we allow it to. And so that's why I wanted to start the High Women. I wanted to be a part of, if I could, shining a light on a different kind of woman, a different kind of life than may or may not, that may be portrayed in rural country music. Just because, like I said, as a kid, it was what I was given, what I was allowed to listen to. And I think about little girls listening to country music in rural areas now, who may or may not be queer, may or may not be different. And I want them to have something because I had something.
Oh, that's incredible. That's incredible. In the corporate world, I would say that the events of the past year have been a real tipping point for companies who kind of now recognize that using their balance sheets for good is the right thing to do. Increasingly, I think companies are recognizing that focusing on social purpose and operating in the best interest of society is actually critical to long-term success. It can no longer sit on the side as a nice to do. It becomes an integrated part of business. Are you seeing the same in the music industry? And what responsibility do you feel that musicians with a platform have to address societal challenges like equity? I don't even, I mean, just hearing you, it sounds like you feel like you have so much responsibility personally as well for that. But how do you feel like other musicians with a platform, what do you think their responsibility is to address equity?
It's such an individual and an emotional concept, how much responsibility you want to take on for the world at any given time. I feel really grateful to take on that responsibility. I think it's a good job. It's a good gig to have if you can get it. And the reason I feel like that is because I had it, because I had representation and I had the people that feel the way that I feel, who are 10 to 20 years older than me. And so that's kind of what I've always aspired to do, almost as much as music in general, is just to be that. And not in an entirely selfless way, but because it actually does my heart good. It actually brings me spiritual fulfillment to be that kind of artist and that kind of public person. It makes me happy, and it makes me think maybe my kids will be proud of me for being that way one day. So it's just personal choice, but I like being that kind of an artist and that kind of a public person.
Yeah, and we're grateful that you are. I think it's not just your girls that you are making really proud, and they can see themselves. So that's wonderful. Speaking of girls, my daughter Noor is my inspiration. She's certainly my source of strength in everything I do, and I'm deeply passionate about doing my part in creating a better future for her and all the girls and women that come after me. You said it. You have two young girls with your wife, Catherine. How has motherhood influenced your involvement and thinking about gender equality, and what words of wisdom do you have to pass on to them?
Oh my God, the words of wisdom are just never ending. How old's your daughter? I think I heard you mention she was 13.
Yeah, she's almost 14. Almost
okay.
14.
I mean, you're probably having more meaningful conversations about this with her than I'm having with mine. With mine, it's about like getting the right storybooks, Princesses Wear Pants, or like Girls Who Rock, stories of, my kids, they worship Michaela DePrince, who is just the incredible ballerina. You got to look into her what she's overcome. She's absolutely amazing. Michaela DePrince or Amelia Earhart. They think that these are people. They know that these are people in history and now who've done like extraordinary things. And so what we basically do is we just try to make all of their dreams accessible. We want them to know that they could be the lead in Black Swan, or that they could fly an airplane around the world, or that they could be the president or vice president someday. So we tell them stories about women that have been able to break through those barriers. And my hope is that by the time they're your daughter's age, almost 14, that they'll be less few and far between.
Yeah. That's right. It's so interesting. My daughter's a dancer, so we do know and talk about Michaela quite a bit.
You know Michaela? Okay, that's great. Everyone should know Michaela DePrince.
Everyone should. But it is, I mean, this notion of just normalizing it and telling the stories at such an early age is really important. Again, going back to this notion, if they can see her, they can feel like they can be her, which is an incredible kind of place to be as a little girl. So I think it's lovely that you're starting as early as you are with those stories. So we're going to pivot a little bit and talk a little bit more about, as we head into Pride Month, I'd love to talk a little bit more about LGBTQ plus representation in the music industry. And you've been previously quoted on how it's very important for you to be out as an artist because of the hope that it could potentially give others in the LGBTQ plus community. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's important for me as an artist and just a public facing person to be out of the closet, but also to tell stories about, my journey into parenting and marriage. I was married while the Defense of Marriage Act was still in place federally, and it was a major struggle for us for all kinds of reasons. And it seems like that was further back in history than it was. And so I think it's just like we have to just talk about it as much as we can to remind people that progress can go backward.
Yeah.
And it's also important because, all the images that queer people have been given for as long as I can remember have been so heteronormative that it's really hard, I think, when you can't picture yourself in a situation, a parenting situation, or a domestic situation, because you haven't really had the pop culture and the television and the commercials and the photographs and the music to sort of like hand you at least a version of what your life could look like. I don't think any of us want to admit it, but a lot of us are defined in our youth by pop culture and the ways that we're portrayed. And there just wasn't enough LGBTQIA representation for me when I was young. And so I really value the representation I did have. And I strive to be a little corner of that in my own way to queer people.
I love the notion that, again, authenticity and being able to be who you are is really, really important. In fact, I would tell you, I'm not sure if you're aware, but last fall, we at Citi became the first major US bank to offer trans and non-binary customers the ability to use their self-identified chosen first name on eligible US credit cards. And it was just so moving to hear from customers and even our own employees about how it made them feel recognized, accepted, empowered to be given a card that actually matches their true self and their name. And we've already had over 10,000 people that have changed their names so that they can be seen for who they are. And, we talk a lot about what's in a name. It's one of the first things we say when we introduce ourselves to somebody else. And, how do you think allies of the LGBTQIA community can help foster a culture and environment where people feel comfortable expressing their true, authentic selves?
Well, first of all, I didn't know that. And thank you for telling me. That's really brilliant. I could see how a detail like that might be seemingly small to a person that's not in that reality every day would be life affirming to someone else. And so that's really beautiful and cool to hear that. I think things like that, things like asking people how they're comfortable being addressed would be a beautiful new change in the way that we deal with each other professionally, no matter what field that we work in. Also, I think that holding doors open for people, LGBTQIA plus people, to get through and pulling each other through when, as another queer person, you get through in your workplace, whatever that is, instead of being concerned that the door is being held open and too many people who identify as non-binary or queer are getting through is a problem, but seeing it as good for you or as helpful, trying to get as many people into empowering positions as you can that are different, I think could only make all of our lives a whole lot more interesting and a lot better.
Yeah, for sure. Well, what advice would you give to LGBTQIA people who are struggling with identity and self-expression? How did you stay resilient?
I would say go to music and go to people, find other people, assemble groups of emotional and spiritual support around yourself. That's what I do when I struggle.
That's lovely. So I want to talk a little bit about giving back, because I know that that's really important to you. And to your point earlier, as much as you have accomplished in the world of music, you certainly have also accomplished even more in some cases in changing people's lives and communities. So you have raised over $1 million for children in conflict, who bring aid to children in conflict zones around the world. Can you tell us why that cause was so important to you, and how your Cover Stories album came to benefit the cause?
Yeah. When my first child, Evangeline, was born, we were hearing, and we were hearing every day, but at the time we're hearing just harrowing and heartbreaking stories out of Syria about the plight of displaced peoples. And at this time, I was taking in these things, and also simultaneously preparing a life of relative safety for my child, and understanding that there is no such thing as other people's children, and feeling an almost, if it weren't for my wife, debilitating sense of empathy about the fact that the only difference between my child and any of these people's children who they were, fleeing their homes with and spending decades in refugee camps, was just geography. And I was struggling to cope with it, and my wife came up with a concept of Cover Stories and aligning with War Child Children in Conflict to raise money and awareness about the plight of displaced peoples. But as that conflict unfolded, and as we saw what happened here in our southern border and continues to happen, I started to realize that the plight of displaced peoples is rampant. It's everywhere. It's people who are asylum seekers, refugees, economic migrants, and migrants and immigrants of all kind, who are all the same thing to me. And none of them are any less deserving of a place to start a life and live in safety and prosperity. So I am really moved by and motivated by helping displaced people all across that spectrum that I just mentioned.
It's just an incredible show of humanity. Even when you talk about the debilitating empathy, almost I can just feel it coming through. How have your fans and your fan club, the Bramley, contributed to the success of the Looking Out Foundation and your campaigns?
The Bramley are like, it's not really, it's like a fan alliance, and they are the Looking Out Foundation. They are a small group of people who are friends and allies that we communicate with regularly, and they help us in our campaigns, in our causes. They help us raise money and awareness. They get their hands dirty. They show up and volunteer if they don't have money to bring to the table, which is immensely helpful too. And then they also find, source need, and alert us to it. And that's why we've been able to have a racial justice fund this last year. We had a COVID release fund, and we branch out into many different areas of need. As an artist, for me, that's been cornerstone to what I feel passionate about, what I like to do. I fell in love with, became obsessed with Elton John over a 5th grade book report about Ryan White. And so the first thing I learned about Elton John before ever hearing his music was I learned about the Elton John AIDS Foundation. And I remember thinking that that is just part of this 360-degree view of what an artist is. And it seemed to me as normal as the fact that he played piano or sang songs. And a lot of my hero worship, which is what it is, kind of evolved along those lines, whether it was Neil Young and Bridge School or Willie Nelson, Farm Aid. I started noticing that all the artists whose music I loved also had this major element of activism as a part of their art. And the Bramley knows that. That's how we became what we are. That's how the Looking Out Foundation became what it is.
Mm. So we have a couple more questions for you. We're going to pivot more into your career and how you've grown your career. And right behind your shoulder is your book, your best-selling book, your #1 New York Times best-selling book, Broken Horses. So you have congratulations on that, and you have had quite the start to the year. So what's in store for you next?
Well, my album is done, so I'm getting ready to put out an album, which is all consuming in every way possible. All I can think about is singing the songs that I wrote for that album on stage. The pandemic has been such a strange reality for me because I'm a songwriter and a singer, but really I'm mostly a performer. And so nothing ever feels real until I'm performing it for somebody. So this album is just like, it doesn't feel real yet. It's like a movie. It's not my real life. So as soon as I get up on that stage for the first time and I sing 2 or 3 of those songs, I think that I'll be able to look ahead, a few more steps ahead of what's ahead of me. But all I can think about right now is singing the album.
Oh, it's lovely. Speaking of singing and music, it's becoming more and more central to the creative process across so many creative industries, whether you think of film and TV, gaming, even brand marketing. How do you think artists and brands can work together most effectively?
I think they can work together most effectively if they come together from a place of exactly what we're talking about today, which is platforming and uplifting marginalized people and giving people who have become disenfranchised or lack a voice or a platform for whatever reason, the microphone. And amplifying marginalized people, I think, will create a more interesting, more diverse, and a more beautiful world for us all in society that we can all be proud to live in.
It's wonderful. And my last question for you, are there any new artists out there that we should be adding to our playlist?
Yes. They may or may not be new to you, but some of the artists that are relatively new to me that I'm adding to my playlist are Katie Pruitt, amazing, Amethyst Kia, Allison Russell, and if you're not hip to Yola yet, get hip to Yola.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. I'm going to go Google a couple of those so that I haven't heard of. So I'm excited. Brandi, it has been such a pleasure to meet you and to speak with you and spend time with you. Thank you for being an incredible advocate for gender equality and inclusion and people more generally. Here is to more women, both in front of and behind the mic. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.